Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. I had said all season, the goal by the end of the season, the Packers season, was 1,000 subscribers. We eclipsed that a few days after the Chicago Bears eliminated and ended the Packers season. So I'm always thankful for all the support. Keep on building up the channel. Defensive coordinator talk today for this video. Packers are in search of one after Jeff Hafley took the head coaching gig of the Miami Dolphins. So the Packers get 2 years out of Jeff Hafley, who came over from Boston College, and now he's off to Miami to take over as the head coach for that ball club. And the Packers have, it seems like it's a good cycle if you need a defensive coordinator. There's a lot of good candidates, and you also have to keep in mind, I'm sure a lot of people are perhaps at least mentioning this as more than just some footnote or some little bullet point, but the Green Bay Packers have Micah Parsons. He's one of the premier, one of the best defensive players in the entire National Football League. Like, he is absolutely 100% undoubtedly part of that top tier. And so it would lead you to believe that if there is, or there are candidates, plural, out there, and there are plenty, obviously, that are in the market for a defensive coordinator gig, they should, in a sense, be kicking in the door in Green Bay to try to snag at least an interview. And it hasn't always necessarily been that case, but when you have an all-world talent like Micah Parsons, and there's defensive coaches out there that are either looking for an upgrade or they're looking for a rebound, maybe after being a head coach and going back to their roots as a defensive coordinator, having Micah Parsons will be incredibly enticing for a lot of these names. We're going to go through some of the candidates, pros, cons, connections, ties, no connections, no ties, things of that nature, what the home run hire would be, in my opinion. And as always, let me know what you guys and gals think in the comments, because this is, completely subjective. Everyone can have their own take on it. To me, the home run, without a doubt, hire, and it does seem far-fetched, would be Brian Flores. There's a little bit of a connection. If you remember back in 2019, he actually interviewed for the head coaching job that ended up going to Matt LaFleur. If you remember last summer, and you'd really have no reason to remember this, but I remember Matt LaFleur did an interview with ESPN at training camp, and he was asked about, is there a coach or a scheme or what have you defensively that keeps you up at night? And he mentioned Brian Flores. Like, he said Brian Flores, what he does in Minnesota, what he's done with the Vikings, is absolutely a coach that you have to over-prepare for. You have to just be ready for everything. And Brian Flores, to me, the injection of life that he would give this defense, this franchise, from an aggressiveness, from that standpoint, you would hope could have a ripple effect on the entire team, offense, defense, and special teams. We all know the numbers with Brian Flores and how aggressive he is. His defense is damn near our number one every single year when it comes to blitz rate. They were number one this year in the NFL. And just to slap some perspective on how big of a difference it is between even number one and number two. So the Vikings, Brian Flores' defense this year, number one in the NFL in blitz rate at 44%. Second in the NFL was Atlanta at 33%. And so the difference between 1 and 2 is pretty substantial. This guy is close to dialing up blitzes damn near half the time. It's always foot on gas, pedal to the metal, until the very, very bitter end for Brian Flores and his defenses, and I mean that obviously as a compliment. And you just look at points per game allowed, and this year it was 19.6, which was 7th in the NFL. Last year in 2024, they were number 4 in the NFL at 19.9. Holding defenses in today's NFL consistently year in and year out under 20 points, pretty damn impressive. And I'll also note this. This is not a shot at the Minnesota Vikings, by the way, in any capacity. The defenses Brian Flores has had in Minnesota, he has been able to squeeze out pretty much all the juice out of the orange. They don't have a Micah Parsons. They have some veteran leadership like Harrison Smith, who, it seems like he might be done. We'll find out at some point this offseason. They gave him a nice little curtain call in Minnesota in his last game at US Bank Stadium. And Harrison Smith has kind of been the brains of the operation there for so long in Minnesota and such a steady piece in that secondary. But it wasn't prime Harrison Smith that Brian Flores got. And, Danielle Hunter sent out a couple seasons back to Houston. There weren't superstar-type players on that defense, yet year in and year out, you just look statistically, Minnesota's defense really damn good. And it always circles back to Brian Flores. His contract in Minnesota is up. He is free to go anywhere. My hunch would be, and Adam Schefter of ESPN said this, which is why I'm piggybacking off of it, because obviously he would have the information. if Brian Flores doesn't land a head coaching gig this cycle, the hunch is that he goes back to the Vikings on a new deal. Where it gets interesting is that he is just not under contract by the Vikings right now. And so he is a free agent to go and pursue what he wants. And so if he doesn't get a head coaching gig and it falls back to the defensive coordinator option, I think it would be idiotic for the Packers to not at least have him in for an interview. To me, he is absolutely the home run hire what this defense and what this franchise needs from an aggressiveness standpoint. Sort of a no-nonsense mentality. Like, his players are always locked in on what's going on, and they execute at a very high level. And they fly around, but it's like controlled chaos with a Brian Flores defense. And if nothing else, let's say no head coaching gig this cycle, or if he gets a head coaching gig, awesome. But if he doesn't and he goes back to Minnesota, if you're the Packers, you could have him in for an interview, and at a bare minimum, you're driving up the price for the Vikings to retain him as the defensive coordinator. To me, I don't know if I'd go as far to say as it's pie in the sky, just because he is a free agent. Like, he is no longer contractually obligated to the Minnesota Vikings. But the breadcrumbs would lead you back in that direction if he does not land a head coaching gig this cycle. But that, to me, is the absolute home run hire for not only this defense, but what this franchise could really use a jolt in that talk. I use that word, but that aggressive department. This dude dials up the blitzes. His defenses don't give up points. They play with confidence. They play with an edge. They play with a swagger that I think needs to be brought out even more in this current iteration of the Packers defense. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We're just going through some candidates, some fits, some ties, no ties. Brian Flores' only tie to Green Bay was he interviewed for the head coaching job in 2019. That went to Matt LaFleur, and LaFleur has constantly praised Brian Flores' defenses throughout the years. There's 3 candidates that have confirmed interviews lined up for the defensive coordinator gig in Green Bay. One of them is Jonathan Gannon, who was fired by the Arizona Cardinals in kind of a weird set of circumstances. He only got a couple years at his first crack at a head coaching gig in the NFL, and he was reportedly assured that he would be back, and then the ownership for the Cardinals changed their mind and ended up firing him after they basically had told him he would be back. So kind of a little bit of a mess there in Arizona that has, yet to be resolved and cleaned up. But Gannon's out. And if you remember, before he had that brief pit stop that we just saw in Arizona as the head coach, he was the defensive coordinator in 2 years for Philadelphia. Things get a little bit interesting because he called the plays, obviously, as the defensive coordinator for the Eagles. When he took over the head coaching job in Arizona, he did not call the plays for the defense. One thing I would note with Gannon is, first off, you get comfortability in a guy who's been a defensive coordinator before. You get reassurance in a guy who's been a defensive coordinator and done a decent job at it, right, in Philadelphia. Where I would pause a little bit is I think there's a very, very valid case to make that, he departs Philadelphia as the defensive coordinator after calling those plays for 2 years to take the Arizona head coaching job, and I think the Eagles' defense got better. Now, they brought in a proven veteran in Vic Fangio, but the Eagles' defense, I think, got noticeably better when Gannon left, and that's not maybe meant to be a knock on Gannon because of who they brought in Vic Fangio, but I do think it's something that has to be at least circled and brought up for the discussion. If you bring in Gannon, there's a lot of boxes that are checked. There's no connection to the Packers, to LaFleur, or anything like that. It's just a comfortability in that there's a pretty long, steady resume that Gannon has, and it now shows that even though it wasn't successful, he was a head coach in the NFL. We know he's been a defensive coordinator. I'll be honest, his results in Arizona, like the fact that he didn't have success as a head coach for the Arizona Cardinals, mean next to nothing to me because he's not applying to be the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. He is interviewing for the job of defensive coordinator. And so I don't really care about the wins and losses he had as a head coach for Arizona. Some of you might, and that's completely fine. I don't really give a rip about it. I look at what he did as a defensive coordinator in Philadelphia for those 2 years. And so he's already interviewed for the Dallas defensive coordinator gig. He's set to interview with the Packers for the defensive coordinator gig that they have available. And you'd be getting someone that's just more than capable in leading a defense. Pretty simply put, if you get Jonathan Gannon in as your DC, I don't think there's ever going to be a scenario where, however long he would be in Green Bay, where it completely bottoms out, there's a tailspin, and the defense just craters. I don't see that with Jonathan Gannon if he were to be the next defensive coordinator for Green Bay. Another name that has an interview lined up, Christian Parker, and to me, he is the most fascinating name for the Packers specifically within this cycle. Keep in mind, Matt LaFleur was hired in 2019 by the Green Bay Packers. And on part of that first coaching staff in 2019, then defensive coordinator Mike Pettin brought in Christian Parker, defensive quality control coach for those first couple years of the Matt LaFleur era. Since then, Parker's had pit stops in Denver, and most recently where he's still at in Philadelphia. Again, you're talking about working under really good defenses, really good defensive minds, guys who have been around the block, been in the league for years and years and years. You're talking about Denver with Vance Joseph. You're talking about Philadelphia with Vic Fangio. And Christian Parker has slowly but surely climbed that ladder since he was in Green Bay back in 2019. Again, that was when the LaFleur era all started. So he was the defensive backs coach in Denver from 2021 to 23. And now has been in Philadelphia, where he's still the defensive backs coach, but he's also the pass game coordinator. He obviously has a direct link to Green Bay. And keep in mind, this is the second of three names. I mentioned Gannon, and now I mentioned Parker, and we'll get to the third one after this, that have already confirmed, officially lined up interviews for the defensive coordinator opening in Green Bay. He has the direct ties to Green Bay. He was a coach on Matt LaFleur's staff for Mike Pettin's defense those first 2 years of the era, as I mentioned. So there's a direct link there. He's also regarded, like if you just read any sourcing articles about Christian Parker, a lot of people are like, yo, this is the next big thing. This is the next big name when you talk about climbing the ladder, where he's at now, defensive, he was defensive quality control coach for Green Bay, then defensive backs coach in Denver, now DB coach in Philadelphia, plus the pass game coordinator. And a lot of people are circling the name Christian Parker, and they're like, this is the one that's going to climb the ladder, be a defensive coordinator, and maybe in a couple years or a few years down the road, he'll probably be a head coach in the NFL too. I would say this: the risk would come from hiring a first-time defensive coordinator and understanding that there could and probably would be some growing pains in some capacity. And if you're the Green Bay Packers, can you afford to risk that with a team that believes, and I think a lot of people do believe it, some don't, but most do, I think. I would say most. This is a team right now in a franchise with the Packers, with how it's lined up. There's a championship window that exists right now. So can you risk that on a young, up-and-coming coach who certainly has all the intrigue, checks a lot of the boxes, but has never been a defensive coordinator in the NFL before? Can you run that risk knowing there will probably be some growing pains? To what extent, we don't know. But there is a lot of intrigue, a lot of excitement around that name, Christian Parker. He could end up being a home run hire, but there's an unknown since he's never had the role before. He also interviewed for the job in 2024 when the Packers gave it to Jeff Hafley. Remember when the Packers hired Matt LaFleur? It kind of came out of nowhere. Like, he wasn't a name that was being rumored about heavily, and then it was like, oh, Matt LaFleur, new head coach of the Green Bay Packers. And remember when they just hired Jeff Hafley 2 years ago to be the defensive coordinator? Kind of came out of nowhere. We were hearing names here, names there, names everywhere, and then Jeff Hafley's coming over, head coach of Boston College, college football, ACC, now the defensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers. Parker wouldn't necessarily be coming out of nowhere because he's worked in the Packers organization before when Matt LaFleur was the head coach, and he has an interview lined up, one of only 3 so far at the time of this recording. Where it would slightly come out of nowhere is there are names like Brian Flores, who, again, we don't know if he's going to be a head coach at DC, how that plays out. But there's names like Raheem Morris, Jonathan Gannon, who have both been head coaches and defensive coordinators in the NFL. And then there's the young hotshot kind of Christian Parker that a lot of people are very, very high on. And it's certainly a name to keep tabs on. One that I know, and we've only got a couple more to mention. Let's go with the last one, though, that has an interview lined up that's been reported. Durante Jones. He is the third and final name. So it's Gannon, Parker, and Jones. And currently Durante Jones on the staff in Minnesota for what was Brian Flores' defense, and very well could be if he goes back there. And like Christian Parker, Jones has not been a defensive coordinator in the NFL, but he was just that in 1 year at LSU back in 2021. He was the defensive coordinator, again, college football, but SEC ranks. He has spent the past 2 years as the pass game coordinator for the Vikings. Where he differs from Parker is, if you put it in a bubble, you can say, yeah, neither has been a defensive coordinator in the NFL, but Jones's resume is a lot longer. I believe he's 47 years old, has had many pit stops, including one in Wisconsin, over a decade ago, back in 2015, and it's the only tie that, like, Durante Jones has never worked with LaFleur before. There's no ties there. There's no ties with the Packers, but I mean, I know it's college ranks, but back in 2015, he was the DB coach for the Badgers. Outside of that, there are no direct ties. But where he differs from Parker is, I believe Christian Parker's 34 years old. Like, he is one of these names that's constantly starting to brew more and more and more, but still relatively young, unproven, but he's doing all the necessary steps to keep climbing the charts. Durante Jones, I believe I saw, is 47, and there's a lot of pit stops on that resume. There's a lot of experience, even though it's never come in the form of being a defensive coordinator in the NFL. What intrigues me about him is he's been with the Vikings the last couple of seasons working under Brian Flores in that defense. If he brings any semblance of what Brian Flores has as a defensive mastermind, it could be a gem of a hire for Green Bay, or really anyone who interviews Jones. If he plans to have a similar scheme, if he plans to work schematically how Brian Flores has operated those defenses in Minnesota, you're looking at a guy in Durante Jones who, it's like, man, if he's going to be just as aggressive and he could serve as someone who's worked under Brian Flores, and I don't know if it's been like, Brian Flores has mentored him, because Durante Jones is, I mean, his resume speaks for itself. But again, he's never been a defensive coordinator in the NFL. But if he plans to roll out a similar blueprint to run a defense how Brian Flores has, certainly a name I would not ignore. And plus, he's, again, one of 3 at the time of recording this that has a confirmed interview lined up. 2 more names I want to go through. Mitch, I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciative of all the support. Jim Leonhard. Intriguingly enough, it was Jim Leonhard back in, was it 2021? Yeah, because wasn't Pettin, I think Pettin was 19 to 21, and then it was Joe Barry 21 to 23, or the end of 23, and then it was Hafley the last 2 years. In 2021, it seemed like the defensive coordinator opening that the Green Bay Packers had after Mike Pettin was gone was on a silver platter for Jim Leonhard. Interviewed for the job, all reports. There's still articles. I went and double-checked before I recorded this video, and there's numerous articles talking about how Jim Leonhard and Matt LaFleur hit it off. And it seemed like it was his job. Like, you want the job, you interview. Like, it is you're going to be the defensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers if you want. And, of course, grew up in Wisconsin, was a Wisconsin Badger in college on the football team, I believe, as a walk-on, but then ended up making the NFL and making a solid career in the NFL for quite a few years. And what a great story it is. Jim Leonhard now he's at the time in 2021 on the staff for Wisconsin, and now he can level up and become the defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers. All signs pointed towards that becoming the reality until Leonhard sort of removed his name from consideration fairly late along in the process to remain at Wisconsin. And at the time, Jim Leonhard noted how appreciative he was for, the interview, for the process and all that, but he didn't think it was the right time to go to the NFL. Since then, he's had a couple of other pit stops, but most recently, the last 2 years in Denver, back in the NFL, or in the NFL, I should say, in a couple of different roles defensively. He's received an endorsement in the form of the legendary Barry Alvarez, who was on ESPN Madison either Monday or Tuesday. I guess it depends on when you watch this, but he was on ESPN Milwaukee or ESPN Madison, one or both of those stations earlier in the week, and believes that Jim Leonhard, called him Jimmy Leonhard, should get this job as the defensive coordinator for the Packers. Rumblings have already surfaced about Matt LaFleur's potential interest in interviewing Leonhard, however, would have to wait until after this Sunday because the Broncos are in the AFC Championship, and then there's like a 7-day window where he could interview for the job if LaFleur wants him to interview for it, and if Leonhard is receptive to interviewing for it. My only hesitation with Jim Leonhard is there's a couple. If he had no Wisconsin ties, would it be a name you're bringing up? Think about that. Think about that. If Jim Leonhard wasn't born in Wisconsin, didn't coach for the Badgers, didn't play for the Badgers, was merely like, oh, that was a candidate the Packers interviewed a few years ago. Like, remember, they interviewed Christian Parker in 2024 when they gave the job to Hafley, and now they're interviewing Parker again. I'm seeing a lot of hype for Jim Leonhard, who might very well damn be an incredible defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers if the job ends up being his. The hesitation I have is all the hype and all the hoopla I'm seeing. If he didn't have any ties to Wisconsin, like, is it more because he's from Wisconsin, has roots here and all that, or is it his actual coaching acumen and his resume that speaks so glowingly and loudly to people. And maybe it is that. And I hope it is that, and not just all the Wisconsin stuff for Jim Leonhard. That has people so excited on the prospects of him potentially being a legitimate candidate for this defensive coordinator gig. That's the only reason I draw pauses, is all the noise and all the hoopla and all the excitement from certain pockets of the fan base, and rightfully so. He has proven to be a good coach, so it's justifiable. Is it because of the Wisconsin roots and the Wisconsin ties, or is it because they actually believe Jim Leonhard is the best guy and the best hire for this opening in Green Bay? That would be my big question. The other part is, I wouldn't hold a grudge over it, but does it not concern people at least a little bit? Like, this job was his in 2021. At least all indicators pointed towards that before he backed out. It seemed like it was his job to lose before he pulled out of the running. Does that concern anyone? To me, not really. It doesn't really concern me. He was straightforward, saying at that time he didn't believe it was the right time to make the jump to the National Football League. But he's been here the last couple of years back in the NFL with Denver, certainly a name to watch. And then the last one that we'll bring up is Raheem Morris. There is a direct tie, not to Green Bay, but to Matt LaFleur. They were on the same staff in Washington 2012 and 13, I think I saw. I might be wrong on those years, but I believe it was 2012 and 2013 in Washington. And there is all sorts of experience for Raheem Morris. He's been a defensive coordinator in both Atlanta and with the Los Angeles Rams, and after he was the DC in a couple of seasons for the Rams, he took the head coaching job with the Atlanta Falcons. Didn't work out, at least to the degree that both parties had hoped, and Atlanta dismisses him at the end of this season, and so Raheem Morris is back on the market if he so wishes. I could be wrong on this, so maybe I'll say it. I don't think he's interviewed for a head coaching gig. I don't think. And so maybe he's one of these names that takes over a defense again for a couple of years, builds it up, and then maybe gets another head coaching opportunity. But that could perhaps be the path that Raheem Morris takes if he wants to stay in coaching. I did read an article that said he could have a broadcasting gig lined up relatively easily if he wants to go that route. So I guess you're kind of still waiting to hear on Raheem Morris. Similar to Jonathan Gannon, there's head coaching experience, there's defensive coordinator experience, and similar to Gannon, the results in Atlanta, because they weren't overly fruitful or what the Falcons had hoped for when they hired Raheem Morris as the head coach, mean next to nothing to me, because he's not interviewing to be the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. He's interviewing, or he would be interviewing for the defensive coordinator job. Again, as the time of recording this, no official word yet on that for Raheem Morris. I'll say this too. If you look at the numbers for the Rams defenses that he led, there aren't a lot of numbers or metrics that like wow you or jump off the page, but it was like they were good defenses. It would be another hire that you would hope he's able to, what was that line I used about Flores? Flores is able to squeeze all the juice out of the orange in Minnesota with a defense that has some talent, but there's no superstars on that defense. And yet it's a top-performing defense year in and year out under Brian Flores. If Raheem Morris can squeeze that juice out of the orange, it's only going to be a better and better defense, obviously, if he were to be the DC in Green Bay. The reason you like the hire is the comfortability of knowing it's not going to be a train wreck. There's not an unpredictable nature to this where Raheem Morris would come in as the DC and things would totally go haywire. It's just that's not in his makeup. That's not what the resume says. That's not what the numbers said when he was the DC with the Rams or Atlanta. And again, he'd have gobs and gobs of talent to work with here in Green Bay, most notably, obviously, the aforementioned Micah Parsons. And so high floor type of hire with Raheem Morris. How high is the ceiling? I don't know. Again, the numbers for the Rams weren't like, wow, that's incredible, but it was good. It was good. So that's the last name I had. So those are the names I'm plugging away at. Obviously, there's a lot more candidates. There's a couple in-house candidates we could mention maybe in another video, but Brian Flores to me is the home run hire. Jonathan Gannon gives you the high floor. Raheem Morris does the exact same. Christian Parker is the lightning in a bottle option where there is an unknown, there is an unpredictability, but checks a lot of boxes, a lot of excitement, and a lot of people circle him as like the next big thing when you talk about defensive coaches in the NFL. There's Jim Leonhard, the familiarity with Wisconsin, the intrigue that Matt LaFleur had back in 2021. It seemed like it was his gig before It wasn't at the end when he sort of backed out from it. And then there's Durante Jones, who has plenty of experience, a long resume, and has worked on Brian Flores' staff the last couple of years. And again, if he were to bring any semblance of that aggressiveness, that style, that blueprint, those X's and O's, could be a great hire for Green Bay or anyone who is intrigued with that option on the chessboard. Let me know what you guys and gals think. I'm always appreciative for all the support. It is Mitch I am on YouTube. We'll see you next time.